Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. For the next 45 minutes or so, we will be covering the results of a major study into human cyber behavior, and we'll make sure to give you insights that you can use in your own human risk and security awareness and phishing training program. Before we get started, let's go through some housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded. The recording and the slide deck will be shared with you later today, along with a free copy of the report from which this webinar is being derived. Please use the Q&A feature to post questions for Maxime and I today. We might answer your questions directly in the chat or save them for the live Q&A at the end of this webinar. If you still have any questions after the webinar, please feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn or to the folks at hoxhunt.com. All right. Now that we have some housekeeping items out of the way, let's move on to the introductions. My name is Eliot Baker, and I was the lead author of this report, along with Maxime and our colleague Petri Kuivala. Just a little background on myself, because I think it happens to be relevant here. I'm director of content marketing at Hoxhunt, but in a past life, I was a science journalist and a medical researcher and grant writer at places like Harvard Medical School and Dow Jones Media. I like to approach original research here at Hoxhunt more as a science journalist and an investigator than as anything else. So, with that said, I'll tell you one thing. These findings are robust and unique. They tell a story full of insights that you can use. It's actually a story with a happy ending. People can change. And here to tell you how to use these insights to manage your own security awareness program and mitigate your own human risk is our own head of human risk, Maxime Cartier.
Hi, everyone.
Maxime has a scientific background and started his journey in cybersecurity 9 years ago when, after noticing that the human element was often forgotten or left out in cybersecurity projects, he decided to focus on it. Since then, he has led or contributed to security awareness, behavior, and culture change programs for several global companies in manufacturing, aerospace, and retail. For example, leading the security culture program at HM Group between 2019 and 2023. Today, he's the head of human risk management at Hoxhunt, and he's been an invaluable source of knowledge and inspiration. Again, thanks for being here, Maxime.
Thanks for the warm introduction, Eliot. I'm really looking forward to the session.
As am I. So, just to remind you, we'll be reaching out after the webinar is done to share a free copy of the Phishing and Cybersecurity Behavior Trends Report. Maxime and I will be looking at phishing trends and the cyber behavior of 1.6 million users segmented by geography, industry, job role, and phishing theme. It's unlikely you've seen data like this. We will be connecting employee security training performance with real-world threat detection behavior. This is a completely different level of insight into behavior and risk than the typical SAT tool's phishing simulation failure rate. We'll be looking at dwell time and threat detection behavior in training and with real phishing attacks. Just a note on where the Hoxhunt data comes from. Hoxhunt is not an email filtering solution. The platform measures lots of different behaviors, but this report is focusing on how people react to social engineering and phishing attacks, not on all the fish that get caught in the net of email filters. We're going to spend just a minimal amount of time with the threat landscape. So before we get into those behavioral insights, let's frame the conversation. I promise that this is not another fear, uncertainty, doubt report. FUD. Actually, this story does have a happy ending. As I said before, that people can change. But that doesn't change the fact that the cost, incidence, and sophistication of phishing worsened in 2023. The slide says ransomware continues its reign. And the reason that we chose that is because a lot of people thought that ransomware was gone. It was sort of like the movie Jaws, where you think the shark is gone, but then it comes back and it's even worse than before. And that's actually what happened with ransomware. The average cost of ransomware attacks went up significantly. The volume of attacks might have gone up by over 10x, according to some reports. And the dollar increase in payouts doubled by some reports, like the one from Chainalysis. Phishing incidents also skyrocketed. One of my favorite reports out there was /Next State of the Fish. They found that phishing incidents went up by 1,265%. Meanwhile, the incidence of BEC, business email compromise attacks, went up about 100%. And 74% of breaches contain the human element, according to the Verizon DBIR. So this is data from the IBM and Ponemon Institute's annual cost of a data breach study. I just want to point out two things. Number one is that I think the study's presentation might have inadvertently diminished the actual cost of human-targeted attacks by the way these categories were constructed. Phishing, BEC, and social engineering all contain a heavy human element, and these are all the costliest or amongst the costliest sources of data breaches. I also want to bring up the element of time. As we'll see when we get into the data on dwell time at the end of the presentation, speed is essential when you're talking about cybersecurity and risk mitigation. The cost difference between breaches contained before and after 200 days is over $1 million. Look at how long it takes to identify and contain phishing breaches. Imagine what we could save if you could shrink that time to mitigation. Most importantly from the IBM report, and this isn't really talked about enough in my opinion, is the significant cost savings that cyber skills and employee training confers. Is it worth upskilling your people? Is that a good investment? Absolutely. The data is clear. There was a cost difference of 1.5 million or 34% in data breaches, depending on highly skilled or low skilled employees. Okay, that's it for the fun. Let's get into the insights. And as they unfold, let's give you all some hope. The study sample, as I said earlier, is 1.6 million users from 125 countries interacting with 15 million simulations and millions of real reported malicious emails. We are measuring whether a user recognizes and reports a phishing simulation, or whether they miss it or click on a simulated phishing link. We are also looking at the element of speed in reporting, which is called dwell time, which is how long it took for someone to report a phishing attack after it landed in their inbox. Again, we will be showing data on behavioral responses to both simulated and real phishing attacks. First off, security training performance by country. So, we will begin by looking at how well or how poorly different countries are recognizing and reporting phishing attacks in relation to one another. Just a note on this, the point isn't to shame a region. It's to open up lines of inquiry and learn from experts like Maxime how we can transform these insights into action. And behold, global resilience. We are ordering cyber performance here by the success rate, the threat reporting rate. From here on out, I'll be handing the reins over to Maxime to provide expert commentary on these results. So, overall, Maxime, what stands out to me is the variance we have, not just between countries, but continents. Look at how much higher performing Switzerland and the DACH region and Finland are than, say, the United States and Norway and France and particularly China. So what's going on? And when you see this data, are you discouraged or hopeful as a human risk leader?
I'm hopeful, 100% just like you, Eliot, because what we see in these figures is that we have a threat reporting rate that is on average above 50%. And even the country with the lowest reporting rate that you've shown still has 38% of people reporting, right? And 38% of people is a critical mass because as humans, we're a social animal. And when we see that a lot of other people have a certain habit, we're likely to start doing the same and adopting the same habit that we see most people doing. So even these countries that are at 38%, they're likely to improve in the next few months and years and catch up on the other countries and see a positive development for everyone. On top of that, even in the lowest reporting rate environments, and we'll dig into that later, the top 5% fastest employees report real phishing attacks in just about 1 minute. But averages, they can hide important things. When leading cybersecurity awareness programs for globally distributed teams and companies, so I was at H&M, as you said, understanding the differences in behaviors between units of an organization, here between countries and region, it's key. Once I have this data, I tend to start where the engagement is the lowest. That's where we see the highest miss rate, actually. And I prefer to look at miss rate rather than click rates because I know that once people are engaged in the training, they're learning. Whether they click or they report, they're learning something and they're improving. And we also have some statistics to give on that later, actually. When they're missing, when they're not taking any actions, they're not learning a new habit and they might represent an unknown risk. So I start with these countries with the lowest engagement rates. And what I could do and what by instinct or experience, I think a lot of us first think about is to do a communication campaign in the country. Say, okay, they're not doing really well. Let's put posters all around the local offices, or let's send an email to people in that country just to remind them. But in my experience, this has typically quite a low impact because the communication campaign might not address the real reason why people are not engaged in the first place. By basically a shot in the dark, right? And so instead, I think it's important to start connecting with local colleagues to understand how different factors, cultural factors, local environment can affect attitudes and behaviors, and how we can together find a solution that is a local solution, a unique solution to improve engagement. The one-size-fits-all approach typically fits none, so we need to meet people where they're at.
Yeah, that's great practical advice, Maxime. I think I want to take one quick step back and ask you something, and it's really basic, but we're talking about threat reporting and equating that with success. Why is a threat report such an important outcome from the user's side of a phishing attack?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The reason why it's a good outcome is that the goal of a phishing training program, right, is to teach people to report threats, to report real threats. It's not to teach them to never click on emails because, that's part of our jobs. And, however mindful you are, there will always be someone who clicks, and it can happen to all of us. So I wouldn't focus on the click rate. I don't like that. I think it's always better to focus on the success rate, meaning that when people report phishing simulations, we know that they can apply the same tool, the same behavior to real threats. And when real threats are reported, right, the security team can take action to mitigate the risk.
Great. Thank you for that. Could you explain some of the underlying reasons behind a lack of training engagement?
Yeah, for sure. So I'd say there are three main factors that can explain low engagement and reporting rates: culture, language, and technical factors. If we look at culture first, so I live in Sweden, and in Sweden, social scientists have shown that people tend to report a higher than average trust in other people, or in the government, or society as a whole. And this trust, this kind of instinct nature trust might be the reason why Sweden also has a higher than average click rate, even compared to neighbors like Denmark and Finland that performed much better in our study. So that means that there's a cultural aspect, a microcultural aspect that we need to address, for example. And so in a company, for me, that would be one thing that I find useful is to share examples of security incidents that happened in the country, if possible, in the company, also in this country. We've seen this incident happen, right? And it's making the risk much more real and close to people. you mentioned FUD. So the goal is not to, apply FUD. The goal is to share what we can do to stop these incidents from happening. But we can't be hiding incidents when they happen if we want to learn from them. Some cultural factors are more related to the company or the professional environment. So, for example, certain countries might have a very hierarchical structure in companies. So this is the case in France. I've just talked about Sweden, but I'm from France and I've also worked there. And in these countries, bosses tend to take the decision and people have to follow the decision, right? And the best way then in this context to increase the prevalence of secure behaviors, it is to work with local leaders and ensure that those leaders are both setting the example and encouraging or asking people to follow security measures or to participate in security activities. And how do you do that? Well, we need to help leaders, to help managers succeed and make that easy for them. So not just ask them also to talk about security, but instead, maybe we can create a 2-slide PowerPoint with some speaking notes on there that you give to a leader or to the leaders of this country, to the managers of this country, for them to be able to share those slides at the beginning or the end of an all-hands meeting, sharing about the importance of reporting phishing emails and how to do it in a speech of under 3 minutes. And that's valid for phishing, but that's valid for any other security topic, of course. That was the first factor, cultural. Second one, language, quite obvious. Hoxhunt has users all over the globe, but we see that over 60% of phishing emails that are reported to Hoxhunt are in English, 60% in English. So in countries where English is not a prevalent language, it's normal to expect higher misentry rate than in countries where most people speak or understand English. So we see that in China, for example. China combines the cultural factor and the language factor, and another one that we'll talk about later. Kuivala, who was a co-author on this report and is also our CISO advisor at Hoxhunt. So he has lived in China and talked to me about this. And his impression was of a hierarchical structure where people can be afraid to lose face to their supervisors, lose face to their team. And therefore, they might be afraid to try something new and uncertain, like reporting a threat. And that drives, again, slower learning curves. The culture is a factor, and the language is also a factor there. There's a third factor. The third factor is technical. For global organizations with offices in China, employees in this country are behind what we call the Great Firewall of China. And this might make their experience of both emailing and reporting suspicious emails just not as smooth as in other locations. It's a bit slower. People might get timeout errors even. And this causes frictions, and the friction can bring people to abandon reporting. In this case, more awareness will not be helpful. Instead, we need to, on top of making them psychologically safe about the reporting for the cultural factor, we need to run tests and try to find technical solutions to make the experience smoother, right? Or if it's not possible, to allow for other reporting methods. So those were the 3 elements: culture, language, technical, and I think they explain a lot of the examples that are on this slide.
Fantastic drill down there on geography, Maxime. Thank you very much. Okay, next we have security training performance by job function. So Maxime, when you look at these reporting and failure rates, what stands out to you?
Here with the industry, and bear with me, it's kind of my best guesses, I would say, I take them as such, but we see that financial services is the industry with the highest performance, with a large margin. And I think it's quite unsurprising given the history of the industry. Financial services organizations are dealing with money. And even if you go 2000 years in the past, we've always tried to protect money, putting it in safe places, making sure that if you do a physical transfer or a large amount of gold, it's protected by soldiers, So security is a huge part of the culture of the financial services industry. And it's such a clear incentive to protect money from ending up in the wrong hands. On top of that, the financial industry is also highly regulated. So they've had stricter security measures and more training by law. But on the other end of the spectrum, you see that healthcare and retail have both low failure, but also low success rates and high miss rates. And I would say this is mostly because a significant portion of employees in these sectors are frontline workers who need to spend most of the time with their patients, with their customers, and not on a computer. So it makes complete sense. But it means that when most people in those industries miss phishing simulations, again, they're not really learning, and it is hard to say how they would react when facing a real threat. And in addition, for pharma and healthcare, especially, it's a bit concerning given the FBI's IC3 report that named it as the critical infrastructure sector that's most breached by ransomware, and that it's experienced the costliest average data breaches for 13 years in a row. But how can we use that? Well, I think there's two ways. The first one is, I think, when we talk about healthcare, it's a signal for decision makers, part of governmental bodies, to perhaps increase funding or regulations for sectors like healthcare when it comes to security. And for us as security experts, if you're working with your awareness program, I think those figures shared here in the webinar and in the report that you receive after, they're a good way to benchmark yourself against your industry and see where you're standing today. If you see that you're above average reporting rates in your organization compared to the industry, well, congratulations. I think you should definitely mention that to your management to see how good you're doing. But if you have below average reporting rates or above average clicking rates, well, then these figures become a really good tool to help you communicate the business need, right? And get resources from management.
Yeah. Excellent insights there. Next, we have security training performance by job function. So, Maxime, when you look at these reporting and failure rates, what stands out to you?
Yeah, we see again, they're quite different, and finance is close to the top, at least. Again, heavily targeted by criminals, access to money, clear purpose. So it's great news that they're among the best at reporting and not clicking. When it comes to communication, sales, and business development, as it says here on this slide, they have the highest failure rates. So why is that? Probably because they are the most external facing functions of the list. Their job means sending and receiving emails when you're part of sales or of communication to and from people outside of the company instead of internal people that they don't know much more often. And perhaps a prospect or a journalist that they've never interacted with. So this makes their job at detecting suspicious emails more difficult. The advice of, being mindful when you receive an email from someone external, don't reply to this external email, or don't click on this external email. It's not easy, or it's even impossible to apply when most of your emails come from external sources. So what should we do? Here, I treat departments quite in a very similar way as countries. My first step is to see, is there a department that has a much lower engagement rate, so a higher miss rate than the others? And I would contact a few selected people there in that part of the organization to understand why and make sure that I can deploy together with them an impactful intervention.
Yeah, absolutely. Once you know who is challenged and who is not, you can really take the right steps at that point. Okay, next we have security trends by phishing type. So there are quite a few types of phishing lures. Our results showed a global failure rate for all phishing attacks of around 4%. The most failed phishing type at a 7.4% failure rate was inter-org communications, which are spoofed messages from, for example, HR or the IT departments telling people to sign up for something or to do something. So, Maxime, if you know that you have certain types of phishing messages that are particularly effective at tricking your people, what can you do to help them?
Yeah, I find these figures really useful for adapting training actions. In the results we're displaying now, we can see that the type of phishing emails that have the highest click rates and the lowest reporting rates. And it would seem essential to me based on this to increase the amount of training on the type of phishing with high click rates and actually lower or not do any more training on for a while, at least, on the type of phishing with the smallest click rates. But There's one thing to consider though. Which of those threats are the most common in the wild? Are those the ones that have actually the super high click rates or the super low click rates? What are the most common phishing emails sent to people out there that bypass email filters? If you can get those two information, both the frequency and the click rate, then click and reporting rate, then you can better adapt your training. I've just asked our threat analyst team at Hoxhunt for reference what were kind of the big things, the big trends that I've seen in the past 3 months. It's not in this report, it's in the tactical threat report. But they told me that they've seen that at the moment, what is quite big is signature services, phishing emails like coming from DocuSign or impersonating DocuSign or Adobe Sign. Anything that is Microsoft impersonation is still very common, planner, password expiry. And package deliveries are actually more active than last year also, so quite big at the moment. So it's not an easy job to do, I would say, combine all those insights to choose the right training. But look at your incidents, look at the insights from this report to adapt, or use a solution like Hoxhunt that is actually adapting the training for you. That's where, you don't need to think about it anymore. Actually, the threat analyst and the training team from Hoxhunt is doing the job. So practical.
Yeah. Adaptive phishing training, adapt your programs, or choose something that can actually adapt it for you so that it actually matches the problems that are in your environment. Yeah, great insight. We're going to have to bring this up. So the year of 2023 was probably the year of QR phishing. So these attacks surged by at least 22 times over the year of 2023. They were nearly non-existent in 2022, but then by October, 22% of all attacks on our user network were QR phish by October of 2023. Now, they have since subsided by about 5x, and that's a really interesting thing. So the reason why QR phish were probably so popular and so ubiquitous in inboxes throughout 2023 is that they're better at evading email filters than malicious links are. So we saw a lot more QR codes bypassing filters and landing in inboxes. However, it would appear that the email filters are getting better at finding them now. And we think that that's probably a big reason why the incidence of reporting and of seeing these QR attacks in inboxes has gone down by about 5x. So while many know the risks of clicking on a suspicious link or file, fewer are aware that QR codes can also deliver malware or credential harvesters. In a benchmark study of nearly 600,000 employees in 125 countries, Hoxhunt found that just over 1/3 of recipients successfully identified and reported the simulated attack, while nearly 2/3, or 59%, missed it, and 5.5% of employees scanned the QR code or clicked a link. So the 5.5% overall simulation failure rate was higher than the roughly 4% global failure rate. But interestingly, QR codes aren't really that effective. About over 2.5 times as many users clicked a malicious link in the same email as they did scan a simulated malicious QR code. And those numbers were 3.9% clicked and 1.6% scanned. So now we look at the real world impact of adaptive phishing training. So here's the good news, folks. Good training does actually work. When we look at the results of people who have been in a training program that is gamified, that is behavior-based, and that actually adapts the content and the curriculum to the user personally over time as their strengths and weaknesses change, people actually do irrefutably change their behavior. So what's the best way to look at that? And that's going to be looking at what do people actually do when a real threat crosses their desk? Real threat detection. So 2/3 of people who are actively engaged in the Hoxhunt training reported a real phishing threat within 1 year of starting training. 2/3. So 66% of people will actually not just a training email, but will actually report a real phishing email. We're also looking at the dwell time. So the time between a real or simulated phishing attack lands in the inbox and the person reports that phishing email will improve pretty dramatically. The fastest 5% of reporters will report a real phishing attack within 70 seconds. We also found that there is a 9 times improvement in simulated reporting over 1 year. Okay, so there's a lot going on in this graph, so let me walk you through it first. First off, we have the threat reporting misses and failures plotted, and we have a histogram of real threat detection. The threat reporting is the green trend line, the misses are the yellow, the failure rate is the pink red line at the bottom, and the histogram is the real threat detection. So notice how it all steadily goes up after skyrocketing and onboarding into a security behavior change program. At low engagement rates, an SAT tool will look only at failure rate, and the goal is to bring down the failure rate without necessarily addressing engagement. That's not a meaningful metric. Look at the far left, the baseline portion of the graph. This is the average starting point for companies who've been using a quarterly phishing simulation SAT tool. So where would you say that you would be on that graph yourself? This pre-Hoxhunt SAT baseline is 20% failure rate, 7% success rate, and 73% miss rate. These numbers can vary widely between companies depending on their security maturity, the quality of their awareness program, the size of the company, and so on and so forth. So again, threat reporting is often not taught. It should be the center of a phishing training program for a couple of reasons. Maxime went through some of them already. But also, it's a simple behavior that you can condition into a user base. It's a habit upon which you can build a culture. You read, recognize, and report a suspicious email. A threat report is the ideal outcome of a phishing attack because it removes the threat from the system. So, again, it should be the center of a training program.
I think also one thing that I want to add, Eliot, what I see in this graph is that although I'm sometimes critical of training is a tool, and when it's done right, it works. That's what the graph is showing, right? That people are changing, people are reporting more and more. And one more thing that surprised me with this graph is that it changes not just over the first few months. Of course, it's more obvious in the beginning, but after 10 months, after 30 months, after 50 months in the training, people keep improving, keep adopting new habits. And I think that's fantastic to see.
Yeah, it's a great point, Maxime. Thanks for bringing that up. Just the long-term sustainable behavior change that happens in here. And this isn't, again, a point about talking about the Hoxhunt platform or the program itself, but we do have to just mention the fact that it is effective, and it's important that it's effective because there has been quite a bit of research that shows that traditional security awareness tools don't work. There was Swiss research in 2021 that came out that had a pretty big study that showed that some people actually were more likely to click on malicious links after being in a traditional SAT program than if they were not. There's been other programs and other research that's shown similar types of results. So this is robust evidence that people do change and do improve if they have the right kind of phishing training for them. Okay, so that's it for us today. Thank you, Maxime. If you'd like to learn more about Hoxhunt or get in contact with us, please visit hoxhunt.com, and I look forward to seeing you in the Q&A session.